Es un enorme placer y un gusto estar con todos ustedes hoy. Tuvimos más de 1000 registrados para el evento. Veo que hay 350 personas conectadas en vivo en esta plataforma y más en el Facebook Live. Realmente el tema de competencias directivas es un tema fundamental en el papel de la Organización Universitaria Interamericana, o UI. Recuerdo muy bien cuando llegué como secretario general en 2015, me comprometí a hacer un tour de las regiones para conocer a la membresía y varias discusiones con rectoras, directores y vicerrectoras y altos dirigentes de las instituciones de educación superior. Muchos me comentaron que algunas experiencias de training y de desarrollo de capacidades en competencias directivas, en liderazgo, en particular a través del Instituto de Gestión en Liderazgo Universitario, el IGLU, había básicamente impactado de manera significativa su trayectoria profesional, porque sabemos que en el mundo universitario, en el mundo de la educación superior, hay excelentes matemáticos, excelentes biólogos, pero no todos tienen un MBA o un curso de formación en gestión y liderazgo, y que los que tienen a veces, estos son programas más dirigidos a la gestión de empresas o a la gestión de empresas públicas, pero las universidades y los colegios están a veces un poco entre los dos mundos y se necesita de una expertise muy particular en la gestión de la institución superior, de educación superior. Entonces, cuando hace unos años, y ahí quiero aprovechar la oportunidad para dar la bienvenida a algunos socios muy claves en este proceso, cuando hace un año y medio el Ministerio de Relaciones Internacionales y la Francophonie du Québec lanzó dentro de su programa de colaboración bilateral Quebec-México una convocatoria para reforzar pistas de colaboración entre la provincia de Quebec y el Estado de México. De inmediato nosotros hemos visto una oportunidad para responder. Ya estábamos actualizando nuestro curso IGLU, nuestro curso de gestión y liderazgo. Estábamos trabajando con ANUYES, con ANUD, con Santander México. Y después de 30 años de hacer el IGLU evolucionó. Era hace mucho tiempo un mes presencial donde teníamos rectores encerrados y discutiendo. Luego pasó a 2 semanas, luego a una semana virtual y un curso online. Y por fuerza mayor, con la pandemia pasamos a un curso 100% virtual. Y obviamente los desafíos de gestión hoy se renovaron, y gracias al liderazgo de la doctora Leticia Jiménez, nuestra directora académica, que era entonces directora del IGLU justamente, y completando su doctorado precisamente en temas de liderazgo, nos pusimos a reflexionar cómo era necesario quizás al abrir 2020 y de repensar realmente cuáles eran las nuevas competencias directivas, las nuevas tendencias en gestión para actualizar, mantenernos de manera pertinente y continuar de ofrecer algo a todos nuestros socios. Entonces, en esta lógica, sometimos nuestro programa sobre un gran proyecto de investigación para definir las nuevas competencias de liderazgo y gestión, y gracias al soporte del Ministerio de Relaciones Internacionales de Quebec, pudimos obtener el financiamiento para lanzar este gran proyecto de investigación. Entonces, la primera persona que quiero presentar es la déléguée générale de la Delegación General de Quebec en México, Madame Stéphanie Allard Gómez, que representa el gobierno de Quebec. Stéphanie, merci d'être avec nous aujourd'hui, merci pour le soutien. Y quiero darte la palabra quizás para explicar cómo desde el MRI han soportado esta iniciativa.
Bueno, muchas gracias, David. Muy buenos días a todos y a todas. Bueno, somos en las Américas. Alors, bonjour à tous et à toutes. Good morning, everybody. Bon dia. Écoutez, je suis vraiment très, très contente d'être avec vous aujourd'hui, même si c'est pour juste quelques minutes, mais très heureuse.
Estoy muy contenta de estar aquí con ustedes y poder iniciar este seminario. Y creo que es el fruto de una colaboración interinstitucional muy interesante entre la OUI y obviamente la Organización de universidades y de instituciones de educación.
La Delegación General de Quebec en México es una representación, una de las 33 representaciones que el gobierno de Quebec tiene en 18 países y es la tercera más importante, y celebramos el año pasado nuestro 40º aniversario aquí en la Ciudad de México. Y el tamaño, decimos, de la delegación hoy en día es realmente un testimonio, diría, muy concreto de la importancia que el gobierno de Quebec concede a su relación con México. Y una parte muy importante, clave, yo diría, del trabajo, del papel de la delegación aquí es de favorecer y fomentar colaboraciones entre instituciones de enseñanza superior de Quebec y de México. Y hoy en día existen ya unos 150 acuerdos de colaboración entre instituciones quebequenses y mexicanas en temas como obviamente la movilidad de estudiantes y profesoral, pero también en investigación y en cooperación institucional. Y también, y eso es un punto que nos trae a la posibilidad de tener este seminario hoy, tenemos un grupo de trabajo Quebec-México, que es el Grupo de Trabajo Quebec-México, que fue creado en el 1982 por los gobiernos de Quebec y de México. Y este grupo de trabajo a la fecha ha apoyado más de 300 proyectos de cooperación bilaterales, de los cuales una grande parte en el sector de la educación como este. Entonces, yo y mis colegas estamos muy orgullosos de poder ser parte de esta realización bueno, les deseo un excelente seminario. Muchas gracias.
Gracias, Stephanie, por el respaldo y el soporte constante de la delegación y del ministerio. Fue un proyecto de investigación que hoy presentaremos, bueno, hoy y mañana, de hecho, presentaremos un poco los resultados, pero uno de los socios principales también ha sido el grupo de Advance HE en el Reino Unido. Hoy tenemos a Doug Parkin, que es el Principal Advisor for Leadership and Management. Doug, Advance HE had a proven methodology that you've experimented in other parts of the world. This was an opportunity to pilot something in Latin America. So if you just want to say in a short minute, just a couple of remarks before we move on, please. There you go.
Well, good morning, everyone, and it's
Buenos días para todos, y es tanto un honor y un privilegio estar con ustedes el día de hoy. Nuevamente, muy buenos días. Para mí es ya buenas tardes, buenas noches, pero buenos días para todos ustedes. Ha sido una parte muy importante para nosotros, para Advance HP, el poder apoyar a nuestros colegas durante toda esta investigación tan importante, al pensar realmente qué funciona para lo que es la gerencia
so we're fascinated to see the results of
de voir le résultat de cette investigation, de tout ce qu'on a fait et de ce service. Je vais bien parler beaucoup plus.
Some broader ideas on perspectives
ideas más amplios y unas perspectivas también respecto al liderazgo. Así que nuevamente, muy buenos días para todos. Es espectacular ser parte de esta sesión tan maravillosa. Muchas gracias, Doc. Y como este proyecto inicialmente fue algo bilateral entre Quebec y México, ahora veremos cómo se va expandiendo. Veo personas conectándose de otras partes, no solo de las Américas, pero bueno, perdón, voy a continuar entonces en inglés. Un momento.
El proyecto original era un proyecto obviamente de cooperación bilateral entre Quebec y México, por eso empezamos de manera bilateral, pero ahora lo queremos extender a todos los países hoy conectados. Pero en el caso de México tuvimos la colaboración de las dos principales redes nacionales para que haya un número máximo de directivos que a responder al sondeo y a la investigación. Así que quiero nada más subrayar y agradecer la presencia hoy del presidente de ANUT, la Asociación Nacional de Universidades Tecnológicas, nuestro gran amigo y colega Raúl Martínez, y al doctor Sergio Martínez, director de cooperación académica de la ANUYES. Entonces, Raúl y Sergio, nada más si quieren saludarse a nivel de las redes nacionales, por favor.
Sí, gracias David, qué gusto saludarte y a la vez agradecer esta iniciativa de parte del Ivory, así como a todos mis colegas de nuestro subsistema de universidades tecnológicas y a todo tu gran equipo de trabajo por este seminario tan interesante para todos quienes nos distinguimos dentro del sector educativo y que gracias a la UI hoy estamos hermanados en todos estos continentes. Felicidades y un excelente día a todos.
Gracias, Raúl, y gracias por las numerosas respuestas que tuvimos de todas las UT del país. Sergio, desde la NUYES.
Listo,
Bueno,
ahora sí,
okay.
Una disculpa, ya, el micrófono no se podía. Muy buenos días, good morning, bonjour a tous. En nombre del secretario general ejecutivo de la NUYES, el maestro Jaime Valses Ponda, que envía un cordial saludo a todos los aquí presentes. Pues primero que nada agradecer en especial a David, a la OI por depositar esta confianza en la NUYES para convocar a las instituciones asociadas a contestar esta valiosa encuesta, que sin lugar a dudas para nosotros también compagina muy bien con las estrategias que se desarrollan dentro de la asociación en el fortalecimiento de los directivos de las instituciones de educación superior del país. Pues eso era básicamente todo, y agradecer de nueva cuenta este gran espacio y que cuentan obviamente con el respaldo de la asociación en las actividades a continuar. Un cordial saludo a todos y el mejor de los éxitos en estos 2 días de trabajo en la presentación del seminario. Saludos.
Gracias, Sergio. Entonces, now I will switch back to English on purpose, all right?
Ahora pasaré al inglés nuevamente. Entonces, bueno, hoy contamos hasta el momento con 400 personas, pero no es para que me escuchen a mí o para que escuchen a nuestros asociados, es para que escuchen al doctor Enriquecer. Cuando nosotros publicamos todo sobre este evento, no pueden imaginar cuántos testimonios recibimos, tantos líderes a través de todo el continente, en varios países. Decían, wow, el doctor Ginsberg se demoró una eternidad para poder reservar un espacio, nunca lo hemos visto en vivo, y por ende esta era una gran oportunidad. Nuevamente queremos agradecer que se haya podido brindar este espacio y estamos bastante emocionados de poder desarrollarlo, nuevamente emocionados al escuchar todas las contribuciones. Tiene una carrera larga, exitosa cuando se trata de liderazgo y gestión universitario. Entonces, bueno, le pasaré el micrófono a Leticia, solo para que pueda presentar su biografía y presentarlo nuevamente como orador. Nuevamente, muchísimas gracias por su compromiso. Muchas gracias a los socios y que también les pasó una muy buena jornada.
Gracias, David. Buenos días a todos y a todas. Es un placer para nosotros tener tanta gente unida y conectada con nuestra iniciativa. Procederé rápidamente a completar el gusto que nos da tener con nosotros a nuestros invitados, a nuestros conferencistas el día de hoy. Leeré un breve resumen del CV de nuestro principal conferencista. ¿Sí? Él es la presentación para después. Gracias. Para nosotros es de verdad un verdadero honor tener a un gurú de la gestión, tal como lo acaba de decir David, a nivel mundial. Le repito, gracias por acompañarnos el día de hoy, profesor, doctor Henry Ginsberg. El doctor es educador, es escritor y es especialista y particularmente en las áreas de gestión, en desarrollo directivo y últimamente en los temas de reequilibrio de las sociedades. El doctor Ginsberg es uno de los académicos más reconocidos internacionalmente por sus aportes en materia de administración. Ha sido nombrado como profesor Glenford de Estudios de Administración por la Facultad de Administración de la
Universidad.
Universidad.
And the Faculty of Administration from Universidad of Miami. And he's an author of different books and many other literature and publications.
Iniciativa sur le web.
A él se une Susan Ginsberg. Ella es doctorante en educación en la Escuela de Trabajo Social de la Universidad McGill, donde se ha desarrollado como investigadora sobre el rol de los profesionales en la salud. Susan ha dedicado gran parte de su carrera a la práctica clínica con pacientes y familiares y familias, con un enfoque colaborativo y multidisciplinar. Se ha desempeñado igualmente como fotoreportera y autora de diversas publicaciones, liderando discusiones relacionadas con los temas de la actual pandemia. Sin más, les cedo la palabra. Gracias y bienvenidos.
I think this is us.
Yes, the floor is yours, Dr. Mintzberg, please.
Sí, por favor. Muchísimas gracias. Bueno, creo que ambos hablamos en francés fluido, pero
I've been a professor at McGill University for 50 years, actually even a bit longer than that. And you can imagine.
Ya se imaginarán esta idea de
Mille administrateurs de la même façon.
It's been interesting enough facing 2 or 3, one dean, one principal of the university at a time.
y ser rector.
Donc,
Part of the Americas in Montreal to the very southernmost. I assume we have people from Chile and Argentina. This is a very unusual experience. Some years ago, I was invited to speak at UQuat, Université de Québec à Abitibi-Témiscamingue, University of Quebec at Abitibi-Témiscamingue, which is one of the branches of the University of Quebec.
Pour donc parler à l'université de
Major anniversary, and they asked me to
Para
speak
su aniversario y me pidieron que hablara.
The theme of the talk became shake la cabane in French, or in colloquial French, kind of shake the cabin. As you can see, the cabin is shaking, and looking at the university reflections, the reflections on the current university and reflections on the future. But I said to them that I'm a professor. I have a particular point of view and particular perspective on the university, but my daughter Susie can bring a whole different perspective. She is a doctoral student in social work at McGill, so we ended up doing this talk together, and it's worked out extremely well, as you'll see. We're going to talk about 4 aspects of the university. We're going to talk about the education,
la partie éducationnelle, on va parler
de la diseminación de conocimientos.
And we're going to talk about the administering, and we'll spend particular attention on the educating side, on the administrative side, because that's really our focus. So I'll turn it over to Susie.
Hello. All right, so I think you know more about Henry. I'll tell you a little bit about how we kind of ended up here together. So as was mentioned in the introduction, my original background was in photojournalism, and I had no interest in academia, and never in a million years ever thought I would be working or presenting with my father. So the first time we did this was sort of an interesting experience, but what we realized is that we think very similarly, and a lot of our ideas kind of come together in an interesting way. So let me just move these slides. Oh, shake it at cabane, it shakes. So we're coming, I think what makes this presentation interesting is we're coming from 2 different generations, which is kind of self-explanatory. But we're also coming from 2 very different roles. So Henry's been, in academia for over 50 years. I came to academia later in life, and I'm kind of approaching it now as sort of a rookie coming in as a doctoral candidate, soon to be finished, hopefully this summer. And also, I think one of the big things that really makes this our collaboration interesting is we're coming from two extremely different fields, so management and social work. Although what we realized what I realized as we started working together is, as much as these fields are, I thought, very, very different, there is a lot that kind of comes together. And you'll see as we go through the talk how that comes together. But I think one of the big things to point out, so these are two images. We're both at McGill. So Henry is a professor at McGill. I'm finishing my doctorate at McGill. And so these are sort of the front entrances of our two buildings. So on the left, you have a brand new management building that got built a few years ago. And on the right, you have the social work building that has had this scaffolding in front of it for about 10 years. That was there to protect from potentially falling bricks. So we've now, just during the pandemic, finally emptied out the social work building because it's finally being renovated. But I think this really captures sort of the two different worlds we come from. All right, so I'm just going to start by introducing our ideas and this model that we're kind of going to present, and then we'll be bouncing back and forth.
On va aller des deux côtés maintenant. Donc,
Lo que vemos es esta idea de que hay mucho en la...
I wouldn't say necessarily disagree with, but question. And so we started sort of thinking about, what is traditional academia, and came out with this idea that it's, this ivory tower model where we spend a lot of time kind of in our own bubbles, often in a hierarchical system, kind of looking down at the world. And we have a lot to question on that, which we will do as we go through the presentation. And so when we started thinking about, what are some alternatives or what are some other possibilities, we played around with a lot of ideas and finally came up with what we're calling the Octopus Model. And where the Octopus Model is different, at least in our minds, from the ivory tower model, is this idea that an octopus has many tentacles that reach out in lots of directions. There's not so much this idea of kind of hierarchy, but lots of arms going out into the community and yet working all together. So it's very much this idea of a more collaborative kind of community model than the more traditional ivory tower model, where academics tend to be up, in their towers, so to speak, often disconnected from what's going on the ground. So I'm going to hand it over to Henry to kind of go over some of the ideas linked to this.
So here are a sort of a comparison of these two models. We're going to be going back and forth, and then later on I'll talk a little bit more about the administrative side, which is of central interest to, I think, a lot of you. The ivory tower model is kind of perched. We, as academics, or as we'll see later as administrators, we kind of look down on the world, and we look down on what's going on in the world, but from a kind of distant point of view. We're perched like a bird observing, and the octopus model is more the idea of being grounded, that we're connected. One is that we're supposed to be objective. The other is we're supposed to be connected. One is that we believe in rigor, and you've all heard over and over again about how important rigor is in our research and our teaching and everything else. And the other is relevance. And that's, of course, been a major debate for years and years about rigor versus relevance. And then one is evidence-based and empirical, based on evidence. The other experience-based, both empirical, but one based more on formal evidence and the other based on more informal experience. So that's sort of the dichotomy. Later we'll talk about how it's not so sharp or shouldn't be, but that's the way it starts. So let's go on to the next step, which is researching. And I'll talk a bit about researching, and then Susie will make some comments, and then we'll go on to disseminating our research. Some of you may recognize these pictures because on the left is Rosalind Franklin, and on the right is Crick and Watson, or Watson on the left and Crick on the right, who you may know, and their modeling behind them, who came up with the double helix idea, the DNA kind of famous, probably one of the major breakthroughs in scientific research ever. And Franklin literally is looking down, but was very much the proper academic, whereas Crick and Watson were much more playful, much more flexible, much more kind of a reaching out sort of spirit. In fact, Crick got his joy out of building physical models, and Watson got his pleasure out of kicking around all kinds of crazy ideas. Crick and Watson won the Nobel Prize for this. Franklin didn't, probably only because she had died before they gave the prize, and probably would have shared it, because Crick and Watson couldn't have done it without Franklin. But Franklin wouldn't have done it without Crick and Watson. Franklin at one point said something to the effect that it was staring me in the face and I didn't see it, whereas Crick was building models so that he and Watson could see it.
All right. So what does this look like in reality, and what does this look like especially for someone kind of coming in new to academia? So one of the things that really struck me is how, despite the fact that research and the academic world is slowly diversifying, and there's still a lot of empirical research, but there's a lot of research that's being done that's not necessarily empirical and using a lot of different creative means. Arts-based research, qualitative research is becoming more and more prominent. And yet we still are evaluated very much on this kind of old school ivory tower model that's very much based on empirical research. So this idea of publish or perish, the more that you can get out there in the right kind of journals, the better. And this idea of sort of publish, and, as much as you can ultimately, because that's going to be your token to moving forward in the academic world. It doesn't match up very well with the what I call kind of, I guess, the newer researchers, if you want, newer type of research that can't be kind of produced at the same rate. So I do a lot of qualitative research, and I've also been very involved in arts-based research. And these are things that just are evaluated differently, that take more time, that are kind of fall under a whole other criteria. And yet when we think about research and what it is to be an academic and what it is to move forward in the academic world, it makes it very challenging for people who are doing research that isn't necessarily empirical. And this is something that I've kind of experienced personally over and over. I've seen many colleagues and lots of seasoned researchers in the field also who have struggled with this. And it can really get in the way of promotions, tenure track, everything that kind of makes academia what it is. So part of the idea is kind of as we think about these different models, to start opening up our ideas and our minds and our administration in the different kinds of research that are out there, and maybe questioning how we evaluate people. Did you want to add anything to that, or?
I'm okay.
Okay. So from there, we're going to go into this idea of dissemination, which obviously piggybacks on research, because doing research doesn't mean much if we don't put it out into the world. So again, as I mentioned, what is the way that we put this out into the world as academics? It's mostly it's journals. That's what's expected from us. And it's not only publishing in academic journals, but it's often publishing in the right academic journals. So, the A journals or the gold star journals, that's really what kind of counts in this world of academia often. But the reality is that, there's a lot of other ways to get our work out there. And there's a lot of really important ways to get our messages and the work that we're producing out into the world, where it can be reaching not just other researchers or other academics, but really reaching the people who either are impacted by it, the people who can make policy changes based on it, etc. And often that is done not necessarily through academic journals. So for example, in this slide, you see sort of on the right is a research project that my supervisor worked on. She works in gerontology and long-term care. And has published a lot, academically in journals that way, but she's also started to publish in, opinion pieces in more kind of like journalistic forms, if you want. And so on the right, over the pandemic, I've done a lot of writing and publishing on what's been going on in seniors care and gerontology, but that's coming out in newspapers. So that's really reaching, the masses, if you want. However, at the end of the day, when I go to apply for a job or promotions
donc j'ai un autre boulot et les promotions et l'argent, c'est la chose la plus importante qu'on voit à gauche. C'est très important sur le boulot qu'on a fait en dehors de journaux. Quand on fait des applications, il n'y a plus d'espace pour les formes. Donc l'idée, on doit...
Creo que debemos pensar un poco más, de forma más amplia, en qué es diseminar la información. Y creo que hemos aprendido mucho de esto durante la pandemia.
Now, with educating. This shows, I think this illustrates it very well. You know, the French word for lecturing is magistral, and it's kind of majestic in a way. You've got your arms up there, you're looking out at the class. The class is kind of distant from you, and today even more so, because we're doing more and more of our lecturing necessarily on FaceTime and those kinds of things. On the right, you see a program we developed at McGill called the International Masters Program for Managers. This is how the participants, we don't call them students, but this is how the participants sit. They sit in a flat room at round tables, and the room would have about 10 or whatever different round tables. And they spend half their time learning from each other. I am of the belief that you don't learn management in a classroom. Nobody has ever learned how to become a manager in a classroom. And yet much of what happens is in business schools and in other places is what you see on the left-hand side, which is, you know, even if it's a case study classroom, it's still looking out at them kind of thing. Whereas on the right side, we only have experienced managers, and they spend half the time learning from each other. So they reflect on experience and they learn from each other. What's interesting about this particular picture is that the woman in brown or green actually runs the program. But that day, as it happens, she was sitting as part of the classroom. This doesn't happen. You won't see that guy in white sitting in the classroom listening to somebody else's lecture, but you will see the director of this program sitting at a round table and sharing her experience with other people's experience.
And just to add to that, I think the other thing that's really struck me coming kind of in and being trained to, you know, eventually probably go into academia is how educating and teaching is such a huge part of what academics do. The majority of academics spend probably about 40% of their time in the classroom. And yet, at least in Canada, I don't know about kind of in, you know, South America or Central America, but at least in Canada, in doctoral programs, we usually have either none or possibly one course teaching us pedagogy. And for a profession that is so based on education, it's always been stunning to me that I don't have to take a single class to learn how to teach, or how to, you know, how to find creative ways to pass on my knowledge to students. And I often give the example, I have 3 children, so I often give the example that I imagine kind of going in, you know, to meet the teacher when you have those parent-teacher interviews, and meeting, you know, a grade 4 teacher who sits down and tells me that they never took a single class in pedagogy or education. And I think as parents, we'd be absolutely appalled. And yet, you know, universities across the world are pumping out doctoral students who are going to eventually become academics, who often don't have a single course or any training in teaching. So it makes for often having, you know, professors who teach the way we see on the left side, because we're just not learning creative ways of teaching and educating. And there are such incredible ways to pass on knowledge to students. So again, something, you know, as we move into the 21st century, is this something that we should be thinking about and kind of reconsidering?
When I worked on our doctoral program, the design of it, I insisted we have one course in pedagogy, one course. And I got pushback, like, whoever heard of a course in pedagogy? And I said, we're being trained to spend 40% of our time teaching, and 40% of our time researching, and 20% of our time doing service and administration. So 3% of the doctoral program devoted to pedagogy for 40% of our career is not excessive. And happily, that course remains in our program to this day, but it's not too common. Okay, so let's come to administration. This is where many of you people are working, most of you. This is more, so I'll spend a little more time here, because this is more what I've spent my entire career looking at, in this case, applied to the university setting. The term top management is used in almost every language and everywhere, and it really captures the idea of looking down. If you're top manager, then you must be sitting either on top of the building or on top of the pay scale or on top of whatever, and you're looking down at the organization. Please appreciate that this is a metaphor. Top management is not necessarily on top of what is going on. If you use a common English expression, to be on top of things, but how can you be on top of things, in other words, understand them, when you see yourself on top looking down on other people? This isn't only a university problem, it's obviously in business and government and everywhere else, but we could do very well to get rid of the term top management. You know, we never say bottom management, right? We never say bottom management. We say top management, we say middle management, but we don't say bottom management. Well, if we don't say bottom management, let's stop saying top management. Let's talk about grounded management on the other side. Grounded management means no matter what you're managing, whether you're the dean of a philosophy department or the president or rector of a whole university, being grounded means you know what's going on. You know what the students are experiencing, not because you're told, but because you're going around, you're seeing it, you're experiencing it. And you can't manage on top. You can't manage from a distance. Going back to the left side, the maestro myth of managing is this idea that a manager, a senior manager, is an orchestra conductor leading everybody else. This is a complete myth. If you watch the players in a concert, they barely look at the orchestra conductor. Of course, during rehearsals they do. They're hired by that person. They're formed by that person. But the presentation of this grand maestro kind of view is really a myth. Where managers who think they're maestros, I think, get in the way too much. The word I like, rather than leadership, is communityship. The really great universities function as communities. They function where people are proud to be there. They interact naturally. They feel good about being part of that community. We need to spend more time talking about communityship.
Do you want to show that other slide? Do you want me to move to your other slide?
No, I'm going to get to it later under strategy. So okay. in a minute. So the machine model, I wrote a book about different forms of organizations, and I want to say that the machine model of organizing, the classic bureaucracy, is fine for running an automobile company where people are doing fairly simple work. It is totally inappropriate for the university. The professional model of managing is completely different, or the model of managing professionals, whether it's university professors or lawyers or engineers or physicians in a hospital, the model of managing professionals is very different. And that means you can't assume that you can learn from business without thinking about it. The model for business, very different from the model for universities. And let's go to the next slide, and and we'll come back to this one in a minute. One of the most popular applications of business strategy in the university is strategic planning. Well, I wrote a book called The Rise and Fall of Strategic Planning because, frankly, I don't care if you do a lot of strategic planning. Nobody in a university or a business or anywhere else has ever developed a strategy through a planning process. Strategies are learned, they're not planned. And this idea of setting up a committee that's doing strategic planning, the university has a whole different way of creating strategy. Before I mentioned the IMPM, the International Master's Program for Managers, and it's a very successful program. There's a healthcare version and a business version, and it brings people in mid-career to share their experience in managing. That is part of the university's strategy because we are serving our community our outside community with that program. What is strategy, but the programs you serve and to the people whom you serve it, product, market, if you like to use the business vocabulary, but in a very different way. Well, it wasn't the rector of the university or the dean of our business school who came up with that program. It was I and a group of colleagues. And the whole university is made up largely of initiatives by individual professors, alone or in groups, who come up with ideas. That's what strategy
Todos
is.
con ideas distintas y todo esto es parte de la estrategia. Entonces, si retrocedemos,
C'est la façon de voir l'université, en fait.
entonces, nuevamente, esto es realmente tomar un riesgo estratégico, el aventurarse por la estrategia. Ahora,
kind of model, the ivory tower model, from an administrative point of view, is measuring like mad. We've got to measure everything. So when we assess people for promotion, we count their publications. And A journals or star journals, as Susie said. We count their citations. And of course, that's data. It's relevant. But measurement is very difficult in a university setting, and even more so in a hospital setting, you know, where physicians are driven crazy with all these measures. If I have to get a difficult operation in a hospital, you know what? I want to be operated on by a surgeon who has a very high death rate. And the reason is not because I want a bad surgeon, but because I don't want a surgeon who took all the easy cases. I want a surgeon who took the hard cases and therefore lost a lot of patients. In other words, all measurement is suspect. It doesn't mean we shouldn't measure. It means we can't afford to be obsessed with measurement. We have destroyed a lot of elementary and high school education through measurement. Let's not do that in the university. We need to serve with soul. The job of administrators in a organization that wants to have a community is to serve that notion of communityship, to serve with soul. So universities have a mission. They're not a business.
All right. So I'll move on to here. So one of the things that we kind of realized as we were going through this talk and kind of getting it prepared over the last couple of years, and kind of it evolved with time, is that we started off with this idea of this kind of ivory tower model, looking down on all these different aspects, and then kind of came up with this alternative model, which is sort of more the octopus model. So one is sort of open and connected, but we want to sort of get away from both extremes. So this idea that, you know, it's looking at one and sort of critiquing that and coming up with another. And eventually we started realizing that we're actually being caught ourselves in this kind of ivory tower model, in the sense that it's not about looking at, you know, one model versus the other model, or this idea that my model is better than your model, because that's so classical in academia, right? What I'm doing is better than what you're doing, and I'm going to prove why, you know, what you're doing is wrong and why this other one is better. And so we started to kind of think that it's not about one versus the other. Ultimately, it's really about kind of bringing these two together and consolidating them. It's not about getting rid of an ivory tower model. We need that kind of work. We need that kind of research. We sometimes even need that kind of teaching, and we certainly need that kind of disseminating. But we also need to be, you know, including more of this octopus model perspective, where we're opening things up, where we're leaving room for new ways of doing things, new ways of doing research, new ways of getting that research out, new ways of teaching, new ways of administrating. So again, I think the message that we realized ourselves was it's not about one or the other. It's really about bringing the two together.
Good. So this is kind of cute. When I was years and years ago writing my book on structure, that diagram on the left is the one I used, and it's the typical hierarchical way of viewing an organization. We got top, middle, bottom, and all this stuff. Susie, I think, was about 6 years old, and she must have been watching me working on these things, and so she drew this other thing. And it kind of is interesting. At the age of 6, she chopped off the top. This doesn't mean she wanted to get rid of all the managers, I'm sure, but she wanted them to get on the ground. And it released this kind of phoenix-like bird. So it's a kind of nice way of illustrating these two models.
And I think also when we were putting this talk together, we both remembered this drawing from many years ago and realized that we've been collaborating a lot longer than we realized, inadvertently collaborating. So to kind of come towards a conclusion, we want to talk a little bit about what's going on in the world right now, because it's been obviously a very interesting time. And when we look at it from a perspective of academia, one of the things that really struck us is this idea that pre-pandemic, academia is an organization, if you want, that moves very slowly. So thus the image of a sloth that does everything very slowly. And, you know, historically in academia, if you want to make any kind of change, anything that you want to kind of put in place, just can take eons. I mean, it just takes so long. There's so much administration to get through, so many hurdles. I mean, even this idea of, you know, journal publishing, if you kind of compare journal publishing versus publishing kind of ideas in newspapers, you know, to get a piece published in a journal can sometimes take, you know, months, if not years, versus getting some ideas out, you know, more to the general public. So I've experienced this a lot over the course of this year. When you write an opinion piece based on your research, you know, you write it, you do a little bit of editing, you send it out, and within a couple of days, if you're lucky, it's out there for the world to see. So this idea that, you know, we think that everything that needs to change has to happen very slowly. I think what the pandemic has really taught us is that things in academia and far beyond academia too can move much quicker if we allow it to. So, you know, partly trying to learning how to get past sort of all these kind of administrative hurdles that often get in the way. I mean, we've certainly seen this with the vaccine rollout and how quickly, when people started working together and kind of getting rid of all the red tape, how quickly things could be done. But I think that's a very important and interesting lesson for academia too. So the example that really stands out to me or to us, particularly to our world at McGill, is that McGill was a university that was very resistant to doing online learning. And yet the pandemic hit, and within 2 months, the entire university had gone online. And to think that in an organization that, you know, if you had said this to them without a pandemic, that you've got 2 months to, you know, transform this university to an online learning institute, I mean, we just would have been laughed at, basically. And yet within 2 months, it shifted entirely. And from what I understand, it seems to have gone well. So it's just a very good lesson, I think, for what we can achieve if we put our minds to it. And particularly if we start working together more collaboratively and kind of moving past some of the kind of institutional hurdles, I guess, that are put in place. And I think now is a very interesting and good time to be thinking about some of these things, because as we move forward, you know, why not build on the momentum that we've already picked up over the course of this year?
Yeah.
I don't know if you want to add to that.
In a visit to the Amazon region in Brazil, now that we're with people from Brazil in the audience and so on, I actually saw a sloth. We went to the flooded forest part of Brazil in the Amazon, watched the sloth do nothing for a long time, and actually connected with some of the research they were doing with jaguars. Our IMPM program took 10 committees and years to get approved. That program went online within weeks. So as Susie says, we can just shift gears very, very quickly. So, yeah, go ahead.
So yeah, I know. I think that's where we're going to end. I guess move it over to questions. So just thank you to everyone. And I mean, I hope we've got to together manage to plant some seeds that you can take off into your own kind of worlds and institutions, and maybe see if, I think now's the time for change. So let's all come together and do it.
Yeah. So if you're in Ecuador, don't think that we Canadians are always canoeing on frozen ice. But we did drag the canoe. My two kids decided that we had to do a photo op in the middle of the winter, so we dragged the canoe out and put it on the lake. The lake that I'm next to right now looked like this a month ago, and yesterday we were out on kayaks in 1 month. All the ice, about close to a meter of ice, disappeared in a few weeks, and now we're kayaking, and now we're canoeing for real. So thank you, and we'll take some questions.
going to stop, just so you know, at the end of the, we've put sort of some references, but I'm going to stop sharing the screen, but they are in the PowerPoint if people want access.
Like good academics.
Yeah, well, we've got two styles here. We've got, some that are journal and some that are more kind of newspaper. So we made sure to touch on both aspects.
Well, I have the privilege of inserting myself now in the conversation. So first of all, thank you, Susan. Thank you, Professor Mintzberg, for the presentation, for your shared thoughts and remarks. This comparative analysis of institutional behavior is quite interesting and quite...
de comportement administratif. Cela est très important, de breakpoint, submission. Je me suis...
Para mí, hasta el día de hoy, yo fui un profesor muy joven hace muchos años y siempre utilizábamos las experiencias del doctor Mintzberg. Y realmente es uno, ¿no? Hablar con ustedes y discutirlo el día de hoy.
I would like to take this opportunity to invite everyone. Está abierta la posibilidad de enviar sus preguntas a través de la ventana de chat. So everyone
to send your questions through the platform.
So feel free to share your questions in the chat room and they'll be directed. But I do have some opening comments and sort of guide the conversation as we were as we were swerving in a canoe right now in a lake. I'd like to start from the educating point that you were using, because this is an opportunity to educate. And rather than being magisterial, let's just try to use this as being more of a grounded roundtable conversation with our colleagues and heads of institutions from across the continent, which is such a fabulous opportunity. You did mention the distinction, that's how you open the presentation, the distinction between the traditional ivory tower model and that structured, institutional, rigorous perspective. And then versus that, octopus behavior, the reaching out, that curious understanding of the octopus about exploring its own environment. It's not just about reaching out, but there's an impulse about curiosity behind how they behave, and something which is remarkably used by biologists to analyze what motivates these things. And so from the institutional perspective, from the structure perspective, from the systems perspective, how do we motivate a structured institution, disrupt the behavior to motivate the octopus behavior? Like how can we motivate this reflection in the institutional perspective and validate curiosity as being a motivating force to discover their surrounding and their environment?
It's an excellent question because it's so hard to break through. I'm tempted to say, let the outside in. And let me give you a specific example. Years ago, I went to a leadership conference where a whole bunch of very proper academic papers on leadership were presented. And I was supposed to make the comments, the summary comments. And while I was reading this, a couple of friends had been asking me, very intelligent people in practice, working for a film company, big film company, asked me about leadership. And I went through these papers and I said, how would they respond to these papers? And so they were called Bill and Barbara, their names. And so I presented and I went through each paper and I said, how would Bill and Barbara react to this? How would Bill and Barbara react to that? And they were like outraged that anybody would bring the outside world in. But I went back and I had to write up my comments. And so I gave the papers to Bill and Barbara, and their comments were much more scathing than my comments were. And I published them. And then I said, no academic article should ever be published. No presentation should ever happen at a conference without a Bill and Barbara test. In other words, if you're having 3 reviewers for an academic article, have one, I'm talking about social sciences here, obviously, have one who is a practitioner who can judge that. Not can I apply it immediately, not does it give me 10 easy lessons, 5 easy steps to do something, but simply does an intelligent practitioner find this question interesting? You know, that's one way to let the, you use the word curiosity, and I want to say something. Totally lacking in this pandemic has been curiosity. I have been trying to push a point about pollution and the relationship with the pandemic, which I think is a key point. I find no curiosity. I find nobody who wants to open up and not say, oh yeah, what a great idea, I agree, but simply to say, why not? You know, if I'm speaking to my Brazilian colleagues, I did a paper once with a Brazilian friend describing the Brazilian people as why not people. Sort of, what the hell, why not? We'll try anything. And I think that's a bit of a Latin American trait, but I think it's especially a Brazilian trait. And this is what we need. We need a kind of why not, an opening up, a more playful view of knowledge, you know. And of course, Watson was totally playful in the DNA research.
And I'd also add to that, I think it's sort of what we touched on during the talk, but I think we really, really need to be thinking more about how we get our work out, because you know, I think it's not just about disseminating it to the general public, but I think by opening that up and accepting it and making it part of almost the criteria of what we're expected to do as academics, I personally think it would allow us to stop kind of working against each other. It kind of becomes more collaborative. It's not just about, you know, you and me and our different little bubbles or offices or whatever, but we're getting out to it automatically connects you to the world. So to give you a concrete example, you know, I've written a lot of opinion pieces over the pandemic, linked partly to my research, but tying it into kind of what's going on in seniors' homes, et cetera. And I get responses from people who write me, who find my email, who are living it, and it immediately connects me to the public, right? So I'm bringing my academic ideas, bringing them more into sort of a journalistic media world, and yet then having an interaction. So I think partly that allows us to connect much more broadly. But I think a lot, I mean, if I look at my experience going through a doctorate, I have lots of colleagues who would love to do more of this stuff, and they just don't, because they're concerned that when they want to go get a job, unless they have their, you know, certain number of journal articles published, they're just not going to be hired. So I think from a, you know, administrative point of view, people who are kind of running academia, so to speak, I personally think we really, really, really need to rethink how we evaluate academics.
I also want to add something in answer to that question, but also as a proud father. Susie has been publishing op-ed pieces and has been on national radio in Montreal time and again during the pandemic, talking about mental health, the treatment of elderly people, and so on. The principal of our university gives a prize for that graduate student who has done the most to disseminate it. Susie just won that prize. And the point is, that's another answer to the question. Offering prizes like this is sending out a message saying, this is important too.
It's an alternative way of motivating curiosity and outreach and exploration, and putting yourself out there in a different forum, in a different medium, and that's helpful, right? In the construction
and making yourself accessible. I think that's a big piece.
And that consultative approach to, you know, with the logic of building communityship that you brought up in your own remarks as well, is this is, you know, it takes a village to pull it all together, and people from the outside and contrasting and how to work it out. And the community is big because there's interest. There's 450 people gathered here today, precisely with the purpose of building communityship around these conversations. Yeah. And in so saying, I'd like to take one of the participants' questions. With regard, you were mentioning Brazil right now and the possibility of bouncing these information back. They're asking us if you have any references or innovative precedents or case studies that you've identified of these principles that are particular to Latin America. And you were mentioning something about Brazil just now. So the question is out there and saying, you know, what do you know about this?
Well, the paper I did with a fellow named Guias Verdo, who is my doctoral student and is a Brazilian, is under my publications at mintzberg.org/articles. I think I think you can search on why not and use. I think that's in the title, talking about the why not people of Brazil. An article that was shown that I didn't mention next to the book, called The Rise and Fall of Strategic Planning, is a study of strategy at McGill University from 1829 to 1980, 150 years of strategy, tracking how the university, this idea of strategy is venturing, this idea, and it really brings it to life. So that's in the reference list that Susie mentioned at the end. So there's that. I'm not sure. There's another article, I think there's another article in there too called Strategy Formation in the University Setting. My book on structure, which I think is used widely in Latin America, a chapter on the professional bureaucracy, which applies, I think, there. And I'm rewriting that book now.
I maybe I'll just mention, I don't have much published on this. I'm just sort of starting out, but I just to sort of mention, because it could be of interest, I co-taught a course with a colleague of mine several years ago. And we originally did it, we thought, to save time, because we were both kind of busy with our doctorates and weren't ready to take on a course. So decided we would co-teach, kind of like that, we'd split the load. And in the end, realized that being two of us in the classroom was just so incredible that it ended up almost being double the work. But we taught all the courses together, we did all the grading together. And it was such a eye-opening and like useful experience that we ended up publishing a piece on co-teaching, and it's published in a journal. And it's really about encouraging more co-teaching as a form of training doctoral students. So that idea is something maybe that could be of interest.
And we did receive a couple of questions that address precisely that point, is how do we incite, the pedagogical approach to academics, and to, just bring it in and build up that notion. So thank you for addressing that, Susie, because that sort of touches upon some of the questions that we've received.
And maybe just one quick thing I'll add to that. One of the things that always struck me is, I love teaching, so it's sort of important to me, but I often got this message that if you've taught one course as a doctoral student, the message you receive is, okay, that's good, like you've completed that part of your CV, now kind of focus on your research and your publication. And I always sort of thought, but that's like, why am I'm asked to sort of continue research for all these years and to publish, but why is one course enough? So I sort of really encourage doctoral programs to, push students to be teaching more, and again, obviously to be taking some pedagogy courses, but if not, this co-teaching is just a great way to learn how to teach.
When they say one course enough, what they're saying is, okay, get Unreal. Don't get real, get Unreal.
Yeah.
And well, yeah, and it's just moving, it's dynamic, and so we need to respond, right, to what is going on. And in that sense, we received a question, and this would be my last question for now, because we need to allow for the report to come through. So this is, how do you connect? Regarding university leadership, how do we connect the current structures of university leadership and exactly what I'm talking about, with new models of university governance, such as networks governance, or the theory of public value? How do we integrate, or how do we move to alternative views of a university or institutional leadership as it is?
Yeah, you gotta kind of, what I tell, sometimes I tell chief executives of businesses, get your secretary to put pins on your seat upside down so you can't sit down for half the time. In other words, get out, see what's going on, be a part of it, join in. The idea that somehow if you're running a training program, you got to have only senior people, never with junior people. You always need senior and junior. That's the beauty of what Susie and I are doing. You're getting perspectives from the beginning and the end of the university process. So it's fairly evident once you get past this idea of top management, strategic planning, measuring. Measuring is a way. Years ago, a friend of mine told me that a very senior person in the British government, when he asked them, how come you measure so much? He said, what else am I supposed to do when we don't know what's going on? Well, get out and find out what's going on. Yeah. Go out and visit, visit schools, visit hospitals, whatever it is. Not just formality, get involved. A woman in the National Health Service of England once told me that that she hadn't spoken to a customer in such a long time, and I thought, really? You don't use the National Health Service? You don't have any family? She meant formally going down and saying, you know, I am an administrator and I'm visiting you as a customer. She was there all the time. She visited doctors, her whole family. She went to hospitals. I mean, those are all opportunities.
If I may, thank you, I have to say. And if I may, I will use your words to just write a brief conclusion statement. You know, I think what we're trying to get to is, and this is for everyone to share with, start thinking about your own institution. It is not a business. So lay down the measurements, grow a soul, and give yourselves a mission. And please correct me if I missed something, but I think we can walk away with that consciousness of lay down the structure, grow a soul, and get out there and make it happen.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.
Thank you sincerely. It's been my sincere pleasure.
Thank you.
Y con eso le quisiera ceder la palabra entonces
And then
ahora
I'd like to give the floor
a Leti Jiménez,
to
directora
Leticia Jiménez,
del IGLU, para que nos
director
presente.
of IGLU, so that she talks about the report.
Gracias, Luis.
Thank you, Luis.
Si me hicieran favor de poner mi presentación.
I'm going to try to share my screen with you.
Gracias.
Okay, thank you.
Bueno, después de esta maravillosa
So after this wonderful
parte de compartir
presentation of sharing knowledge,
me voy a permitir hacer una breve presentación, un reporte ejecutivo de lo que nosotros desarrollamos como investigación. Como ustedes saben, este evento está dividido en 2 días. Entonces, hoy lo que haré será un breve recorrido sobre cómo llegamos a este punto de dónde arrancamos y a dónde llegamos en este proceso de investigación. El día de mañana ahondaremos junto con el equipo de investigación un poco más sobre qué encontramos, qué más encontramos más allá de lo que yo les voy a comentar. De que estamos ya avanzados en el tiempo, entonces trataré de ser muy ejecutiva en la entrega de esta información, en compartir esta información. Nosotros, bueno, la presentación está integrada principalmente por 4 puntos que quiero, que nos permiten ir del origen de la idea a dónde llegamos, ¿sí? Hablaré entonces de los antecedentes de esta investigación, de las 2 etapas de trabajo que tuvimos que realizar tratando de buscar información dentro de nuestros, en conjunto con los directivos que colaboraron, y una pequeña parte de los resultados, y, porque como les comento, mañana aún no. Bueno, ¿de dónde sale esta idea? ¿Cuál es el origen? Miren, les comparto que esta propuesta de investigación surge principalmente de la interacción con directivos durante 3 años, en los cuales, como ya comentaba David, su servidora fungió como directora del Instituto de Gestión y Liderazgo Universitario. Un programa que creo que es muy conocido, estamos seguros que es muy conocido en América Latina y especialmente en nuestras universidades todos de la obra. El IGLU desde un inicio se caracterizó por ser un programa de formación para rectores, como lo comentaba David en el inicio. Sin embargo, hemos tenido que evolucionar. Una primera etapa se evolucionó una vez revisando que formar rectores o apoyar a los rectores en la formación de gestión y de administración no era suficiente. Empezamos a bajar a un nivel más amplio, que fue integrar a los equipos para desarrollar esta formación en conjunto y poder lograr una visión de equipo que pudiera tener un mayor impacto en las universidades. Ha habido otros rediseños de la formación que nosotros damos, pero uno que he encabezado yo fue, el primero fue en 2018, cuando yo llego a esta dirección, ¿sí? Y como les comentaba, yo empiezo a tener contacto con los directivos y empiezo a identificar que hay más áreas en las que podemos apoyar a los directivos en las diferentes etapas. Los que van llegando al cargo, los que ya están en cargo y los que están planeando o están teniendo un proyecto de vida para llegar a un cargo de liderazgo dentro de las CIES, ¿sí? En ese sentido, el primer rediseño que realizamos, lo centramos en 5 grandes áreas que tenían que ver con despertar en cada directivo, por ejemplo, el interés por la gestión estratégica, por la gestión académica, visualizar la importancia de gestionar los recursos, que es una responsabilidad con la que tú llegas a cargo, con la gestión de proyectos que nos puede ayudar a solucionar problemas que se presenten, ¿sí? O a innovar, y finalmente la autogestión personal o la gestión personal. ¿Sí? ¿Qué fue lo que hicimos? Bueno, David ya lo platicó, pero buscamos formas de prepararnos para ese futuro. ¿Sí? Ahora recién se hablaba de cómo podemos avanzar implicando gente que participa directamente en los procesos, y fue precisamente lo que hicimos. Si bien ya teníamos un rediseño en 2018, vimos la necesidad de empezar a proyectar qué haríamos una vez que este rediseño empezara a dejar de tener tanta importancia y tendríamos que buscar nuevas áreas de formación. Y decidimos que la mejor forma era yendo a preguntarles a los directivos qué necesitaban, qué era importante para ellos, cómo estaban viviendo ellos su dirección, cómo se visualizaban ellos frente a un cargo directivo dentro de las universidades. Aquí tuvimos, afortunadamente, el gran apoyo del Ministerio de Relaciones Internacionales de la Francofonía, que nos permitió avanzar con un gran apoyo en este planteamiento. Siguiente. En este sentido, recogimos las ideas que teníamos y nos planteamos un objetivo, ¿sí? ¿Cuál era nuestro objetivo al final de este recorrido que iniciamos en 2019? Bueno, era principalmente establecer un mapa de competencias, contar con una herramienta que nos dijera qué es lo que están pensando en este momento los directivos que es necesario para ejercer su fuerza. ¿Qué necesitan? ¿Qué percibieron ellos que cuando llegaron les hacía falta? ¿Y qué valoraron ellos que lo que llevaban les había servido? ¿Sí? Entonces, nuestro objetivo final es ese. Contar con un mapa de competencias, ¿sí? Que nos permita generar estrategias de formación y que apoyen directamente esos cargos que nosotros estamos analizando, que son los cuadros directivos de las universidades. Ahora, hay un objetivo, pero también hay un propósito. Creemos que el propósito va más allá del logro de resultados. El propósito va cargado de una intención y de una sensación, de una visión de servir a través de lo que estamos produciendo. Y nuestro propósito puede ser romántico, puede ser real, pero nuestro propósito está puesto en esto. Primero, mejorar y actualizar las acciones formativas primero desde el iglú y luego compartiendo esa herramienta para apoyar el diseño en las universidades con las que nosotros trabajamos o cualquier universidad que quiera utilizar. ¿Ya? Muchas de las universidades generan su propia formación al interior y para eso estamos produciendo también nosotros. La otra es apoyar en el diseño de mejores perfiles de los puestos en las IES, que es algo que también hemos identificado, ¿sí? Y en último paso, bueno, extender este estudio más allá de la región México, del país de México, irnos hacia América Latina. ¿Ya? Nuestro estudio estuvo dividido en 2 etapas, tratando sobre todo de cubrir la mayor información posible, tanto cualitativa como cuantitativa, que nos permitiera tener muy claro cómo podríamos conformar esa herramienta, ¿sí? Esta actividad partió principalmente o en primera instancia del Instituto de Gestión del IGLU y generando la metodología de Focus Group. Y ahí tuvimos el gran apoyo de la Universidad de Montreal, a través de un investigador que colaboró con nosotros de manera presencial. Creo que fue el último viaje que pudimos hacer antes de la pandemia, porque nuestra reunión fue el 28 de febrero del 2020, entonces creo que el último viaje que hicimos varios. Ahí el investigador de la Universidad de Montreal condujo la parte académica y el IGLU condujo la parte metodológica. Y este evento no hubiera sido posible sin el apoyo de las NUYES, quien jugó un papel muy importante, tanto en la proporción del espacio para trabajar esta actividad, así como para la convocatoria. Los resultados de esta primera parte fueron, tuvimos 30 participantes, de ellos el 38% fueron hombres y el 62% las mujeres. Muy buena respuesta a las mujeres. Participaron 25 universidades, todas ellas de México. ¿Y qué arrojó esta primera actividad? Bueno, arrojó una primera lista preliminar de 11 competencias relacionadas principalmente con los primeros 5, con las 5 áreas del IGLU. La segunda etapa fue construida con los resultados obtenidos de la primera etapa del Focus Group, pero también con un instrumento ya validado, proporcionado por Advanced Education, y lo que nos permitió construir nosotros y adaptar un instrumento que pudiera ser representativo para la región y para las características del estudio que nosotros estábamos desarrollando. Eso estuvo a cargo del equipo de investigación de la OUI y del IGLU, ¿sí? Y de nuevo, esta investigación colaborativa pudo ser realizada, esta etapa pudo ser realizada gracias al gran apoyo de la NUD y de la NUYES nuevamente, quienes en una movilización sumamente organizada logramos obtener la participación de 105 instituciones, la respuesta de 105 instituciones a participar, a contestar este cuestionario de 40 ítems aproximadamente, ¿sí? Y obtuvimos 981 participaciones o respuestas a este cuestionario, lo que nos permitió trabajar con en muy buenos términos. ¿Sí? Aquí el papel se invirtió, fueron más hombres que mujeres, ¿sí? Posiblemente tenga que ver con la cantidad de hombres que están en los cargos directivos, a diferencia de las mujeres. Aún así no es mucha la diferencia. Ok. Con estos resultados que obtuvimos, nosotros pudimos hacer una primera discusión. Nosotros volvimos sobre nuestros pasos a revisar qué era lo que estábamos trabajando antes de obtener estas 900 tantas preguntas, estas respuestas, y empezamos a identificar qué competencias de esas que habíamos obtenido estaban reflejadas en el programa que actualmente tenemos de formación. Bueno, encontramos pues que aunque nosotros habíamos trabajado con esa parte de gestión estratégica, de gestión académica, de gestión de recursos y de gestión de proyectos, encontramos una gran cantidad de competencias que más que ser específicas de cada área, tienden a ser transversales, ¿sí? Y tienden a ser transversales, ¿por qué? Porque están basadas principalmente en las competencias de autogestión, ¿sí? Eso nos lleva a reflexionar que más allá de poner la mirada frente a los procesos, habría que voltear primero a ver a la persona, ¿sí? Curiosamente, en los hallazgos que se obtuvieron del cuestionario, encontramos cosas que no habíamos considerado dentro de la formación en los cursos que tenemos en este momento. ¿Podrían poner la siguiente? ¿Sí? ¿Qué encontramos? Es un resumen de los resultados. Como les digo, los resultados a fondo los veremos mañana. Pero esta es una simple comparación entre el lugar de donde partimos y hacia dónde llegamos. ¿Sí? ¿Qué es lo que pasó aquí? Este reporte se elabora poniendo de manifiesto principalmente funciones conceptuales y operacionales de competencias que encontramos. Y para poderle dar un orden, especificamos en factores. De esta forma, el primer factor que resulta de vital importancia para quienes nos respondieron en el cuestionario son las competencias de liderazgo, o sea, desarrollar competencias de liderazgo, de actitudes y de valores del servicio, ¿sí? Que son algunas competencias que posiblemente no habíamos considerado nosotros. Entre este factor podemos encontrar la escucha, ¿sí? Como parte de la comunicación, la empatía, ¿sí? Los valores morales, la apertura, la diversidad, la inclusión, la adaptabilidad, la resiliencia y la inteligencia emocional. Creo que en esta parte se visualiza un impacto, creo que favorable al conocimiento o a la convivencia que últimamente o que hemos tenido sobre los objetivos del desarrollo sostenible. Empieza a haber un pensamiento más sistémico por parte de los a entender otros aspectos que posiblemente no se habían considerado. En el factor 2, se concentran las habilidades de gestión, planificación e innovación, que creo que son las habilidades tradicionales para las que quienes trabajamos como directivos o quienes estamos llegando a la dirección o queremos llegar, deben de estar bien claras que son necesarias e indispensables, ¿sí? Y finalmente, el factor número 3, que tiene que ver con la experiencia y conocimiento de la organización. Y yo aquí dividiría tanto experiencia como conocimiento de la organización, porque puedo tener experiencia dentro de la organización y eso puede facilitarme mi desarrollo como líder, como directivo dentro de la universidad, pero también la otra experiencia, que es la que puedo adquirir en otras áreas que puede ser aplicada dentro de mi área de trabajo. Entonces, el valor de la experiencia es como experiencia de vida, a mí como persona, cómo me enriquece, y como experiencia dentro del ámbito universitario, ¿verdad? Esos tres factores, de manera global, lo que pretendemos es tomarlos y analizarlos desde la perspectiva del curso de formación que tenemos en este momento y tratar de entender, como decía y Susan, desde otra mirada, ¿verdad? No verlo desde arriba, como estructuralmente hemos visto la formación, como estructuralmente hemos visto la capacitación de las personas, sino empezar a entretejer dentro de estas formaciones cosas que van, aspectos que van desde lo personal, desde lo actitudinal, desde los valores, mezclados con las habilidades, pero que me dan a través de mi experiencia o me traen nuevas experiencias de los otros para mejorar mi desempeño dentro de las instituciones. Finalmente, me gustaría dar un reconocimiento público al equipo que trabajó arduamente en esta investigación y que, como les comento, estará el día de mañana presentando de viva voz los resultados. Y este es un poco un resumen del gran trabajo que hicimos durante casi año y medio para poder llegar a obtener estos resultados. Y no sé si hay alguna pregunta. Parece que no. Si no, mañana estaremos listas para responder más a fondo con el contenido de nuestro reporte. ¿Sí? Y quisiera agradecer su presencia el día de hoy. Para nosotros fue una gran sorpresa el interés que despertó este seminario. Esperamos haber cubierto sus expectativas de esta primera sesión. El día de mañana tenemos una conferencia del mismo nivel que la de hoy. Hablaremos sobre liderazgo, sobre las perspectivas. Hoy hablamos sobre perspectivas de gestión, mañana hablaremos sobre perspectivas de liderazgo. Esperamos contar con ustedes y que nos acompañen en la presentación de los resultados. El documento de la investigación será enviado vía correo electrónico a las personas que se registraron y cualquier cosa estaremos mañana aquí presentes esperándolos a quien esté interesado. Muchísimas gracias por su atención. Que pasen muy buenas tardes.
Y con eso damos por terminada la sesión del día de hoy. Muchas gracias a todos por su presencia. Gracias por su participación. Y ya como decía la doctora Jiménez, nos vemos mañana para la presentación de los detalles de la investigación. Muchas gracias. Hasta la próxima.